So thanks again, everybody, for being here. It's been the recent weeks, I'm sure not just for me, but speaking for myself, have been really exhilarating and particularly disturbing at the same time. And the practices and the teachings that I worked to include in my day-to-day life have really helped me to cope and to ride the waves of all this in ways that I see that I've sometimes have expanded resiliency around everything that's going on, and that can mean things that are going on in our country and things that are going on in my personal life as well. So it has not been a quiet time for sure. Um, Even though there's a lot of time sitting at home, it's not a quiet time. A lot's been changing, and a lot of it has been happening quickly. And there has been and continues to be a lot to absorb and a lot to integrate. So really one of the few things that I could say about all of that, that I know with confidence, is that we are complex beings. And I believe that we have the capacity to hold many different and opposing emotions and thoughts that come our way. And we can hold them all at once. And while that can be a lot for us, I've also come to see that it's not just our minds, but also our bodies, and in fact, our whole beings that work very quickly to attempt to make sense of what we experience. And that's what I want to talk about today. So to do this, I ended up going this route, looking at the core teaching of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths. And while I'm not going to go through all about the Four Noble Truths, don't worry. I'll just say first is about suffering, then there's the arising of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the Eightfold Path. So traditionally, they're known as the Noble Truths. But a different phrase and title has been gaining some popularity these days, and it's the Noble Tasks. So you may have heard this before. I first heard it from Stephen Batchelor, who wrote a book called Beyond Buddhism, and he brings up the Four Noble Tasks in there. So let's take a look at the first noble truth, or the first noble task of suffering, to see what this is about. So many of us have learned that the first noble truth is suffering, dukkha. Suffering exists. Now, maybe not everybody's learned it that way, but an accurate translation from the Pali Canon really goes further than that. It says suffering is to be comprehended. Or in the Sutta, it says, a noble disciple understands suffering. So I'll just read the full line as it's translated by Bhikkhu Bodhi, who translated the Pali Canon to English. And it's this one part says, when, friends, a noble disciple understands suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the way leading to the cessation of suffering, in that way he is one of right view and has arrived at this true Dhamma. So just to notice, he said on the first one, when, friends, a noble disciple understands suffering. So what's the difference between suffering exists and suffering is to be understood, or suffering is to be comprehended? So if you think about that for a moment, what's the difference? Suffering exists is more like a statement or a fact or maybe a philosophical idea. It's a truth. And I really don't believe that anybody could successfully, dispute the truth that suffering exists. But saying suffering is to be understood to be comprehended suggests that there's more to this. To me, it already assumes suffering exists. And then it goes on to give us an assignment, a task. It suggests that there is work for each of us to do in order to gain liberation, in order to arrive at this true Dharma. So it seems to me that the Buddha is suggesting that people pay attention to the difficult experiences and perhaps learn from them rather than turning away from them, or habitually overlooking and ignoring them, or reacting to them. It's not quite so easy to do, but it makes a whole lot of sense to me. Sometimes it can be easy, but practically, it takes some work. We're naturally inclined to get those things we don't like, that we don't want, out of our lives, or the things we want into our lives. We want to push those things away when they're particularly difficult. Who wants that? But I think with practice and courage, I think we can look at that. And I believe it can get easier. And I believe what the Buddha is suggesting, that ultimately it's rewarding. When we're not paying heed to what is tragic, we become enamored and seduced and captivated by what's agreeable. And that traps us. And we become afflicted, pushing away, or even stuffing down feelings whenever we experience dukkha. So when this is habitual behavior, it can be very limiting. So again, I think what is being suggested here is to go against that habitual behavior when you can. The disregard of dukkha, which is truthfully and simply just part of life that we inhabit, I don't think is healthy. I don't think it helps us. Paying heed to the moments when we suffer moves us away from beliefs such as life is suffering. So that's not what the Buddha said. He said there is suffering, but he didn't say life is suffering. And also craving is the origin of suffering. That's another one that I've been thinking about from some of what I've been reading. We can move away from that. But it takes looking at it. It takes looking at the dukkha and experiencing it, sometimes in dribs and drabs, because you can't always take everything on all at once. It takes looking at it to perhaps get through it. So let's just unpack the sentence a little bit more, just on the language of suffering. Dukkha is to be comprehended. Parinya, if I'm pronouncing that right. So starting with what is the origin of dukkha, or what is the meaning of suffering? Let's first look at an English translation of suffering, an English definition of suffering from Merriam-Webster: to endure death, pain, or distress, to sustain loss or damage, to be subject to disability or handicapped. Now, much of that is common with the Pali word dukkha, but it may not be incorrect, but it's inadequate. So let's look at the classical Buddhist definition of dukkha. And the Buddha was quite specific. And to me, I see it as a wider scope. He doesn't say clinging is the source of dukkha. He doesn't say dukkha is everything. He says birth is dukkha. Aging is dukkha. Sickness is dukkha. Death is dukkha. Separation from what is dear to us is dukkha. And not getting what one wants is dukkha. I think it encompasses more than the English translation. Okay, so the second part of that sentence, suffering, dukkha, is to be comprehended. Let's get on to the comprehended, parinya. This is where the task and noble task is. So the Buddha encouraged comprehension, which literally, parinya is literally translated from what I've read, because I'm not an expert in the language, but it's literally translated as total knowing. So this implies that we can get to know our dukkha. Yippee, lucky us. But maybe we are. Actually, maybe we are lucky us if we get to know it. We can get to know it like the back of our hand, or like our favorite song or piece of music, or a person we're really close to. We can have a deep understanding that goes beyond the words. We can have a complete understanding. We can see a certain, when we have complete understanding, or at least deeper understanding, we can see a circumstance that we're in with clearer eyes. And then we can see how to respond in the best way possible. Maybe in a better way that if we didn't have those open eyes. So then rather than reacting or ignoring, stuffing down, just moving on to the next thing in our life that's so a wonderful distraction, gets us away from the difficulty, well, we can look at it and maybe we can come through it for the better. And it can lead us away from blaming ourselves when things go wrong. To me, that's a really important point. Because when things go wrong, it's so easy to start shooting those second arrows that I would think everybody here has heard about. You know, we don't need to make it more painful. Something hard or some kind of difficulty is already going on. We don't need to start blaming ourselves. So I think what the Buddha is proposing or offering is that when we do this, when we look at this, that's what I mean by when we do this, when we look at dukkha, we can see the terrible thing with total and complete honesty. When we can do that, we will have changed our relationship with the dukkha. And whether or not it changes the facts of the situation that we're in or the experience that we're having isn't the point. The point is that your experience, my experience of the suffering, yeah, can really change. It takes courage. For those of you who know about Mara in the Buddha stories, when the Buddha says, I know you, Mara, I think that's what he's talking about. Saying, oh, I know you suffering. Okay, I see what you're about. And now that I see what you're about, I have another way to deal with this. I don't have to fall into the traps of the way I've been thinking in the past or dealing with the problems in the past. See, the Buddha's view on comprehension of dukkha is unsentimental and it's realistic. It's a recognition that we keep meeting what we do not like. We lose what we cherish. We fail to get what we desire. And this understanding is inclusive of every aspect in our sensory world. So the way we experience this is through what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and our subjective responses to the world, our feelings, our perceptions, our inclinations, our consciousness. And awareness of these things that I just mentioned, the way we connect with the world, the way we are in contact with the world. These are the clues, I think, or these are some of the clues that can help us to put this kind of understanding into practice when dukkha arises. I don't think the Buddha is saying you have to be enlightened before this. And I don't think that we need to be. I think we can work with this in the present because that's where this is happening. It's in the present that we can look at the nature of what's going on. And sometimes these clues that I'm talking about, these sensory clues or mental clues, can be very subtle, and sometimes they can be very strong. But if we practice being mindful throughout the day, as often as we can, in a comfortable way, we'll get better at noticing when these clues arise, particularly in our body. And yeah, the body's a really good place to look. Now, sometimes the clues can be really confusing. Might be, this happens to me a lot. I think I'm hungry. I think I'm hungry. Really, I'm thirsty. And I don't really need to eat more, but I'm thirsty. And I keep thinking, oh, let me go eat some more. All right. Anyway, sometimes the clues can be really disturbing, or they can be frightening, and they could be anywhere in your body. So be gentle if you practice this way. Don't push on it too much. Don't try too hard. If it's too much for you, take a break. You don't have to force yourself into trauma triggering. You don't have to force yourself into more upset with it. But if you can notice it calmly, and I think that's where meditation really helps. You're a human being with many emotions and many thoughts going through you, sometimes a mile a minute, often a mile a minute. So you don't need to be perfect at this. But if you can just steer your ship, just guide yourself towards noticing what you're experiencing, maybe even with some curiosity, if you're so inclined. That's a way that we can practice this. So let's get a little uh, practical, just a little example. So perhaps you got some bad news, and then you're in a conversation with somebody. And then you notice you have a real edge. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Or maybe that person has an edge, and you're like, why do they sound this way to me? It could be because they had something happen. And then how do you notice it? What clued you to that? Might be that there was tightness in your body. Might be that tipped you off, or maybe there was some other sensation. But check in with yourself. You don't have to make it a big ritual. You can be sitting at work with somebody if you're at work, or you can be sitting and just take a quick notice to yourself. It doesn't take that much. And you can go, oh, something feels a little bit different here. You might even say it feels like dukkha. Simply put, you're noticing that dukkha has arisen. When you notice that and you acknowledge that, it's not that there's something wrong. Nothing is wrong. Something is right because you're seeing what you've experienced or what you're experiencing. And now perhaps that opens up your vision a little bit, perhaps, because it doesn't happen every time. But I think the more we do this, the more it can. And now maybe instead of reacting, you can see that there are new options. Maybe, maybe you could be okay even if you didn't get what you want. Really wanted that job. I didn't get it. Maybe it's all right. Maybe that wasn't the right job for me after all. But if I'm just so fixated on I didn't get that job, well, then I'll never see that. Maybe that wasn't the right job for me. You could look at what your intentions are. You could open to alternatives in this way. And again, be gentle because, sometimes you can do this and sometimes you can't. We're not enlightened beings yet. um, but the body and the mind can tip you off, is what I'm saying, and perhaps lead you to acceptance of the existence of dukkha in this particular time. I'm not talking about dukkha in the grand scheme of the world. I'm talking about in you, in me. Something has happened that's causing me to suffer. Might be physical pain, might be an argument I had, something I did wrong, mistake I made. Well, what if I, instead of going, I didn't really make that mistake, it was their fault. Or perhaps I could be, there's a lot of causes and conditions that led to that mistake. Look at what happened from externally from whatever went on, and let's look at what happened from my side. If I was in this circumstance again, what would I do differently? But let's even back up. What do I feel about it? Where do I feel it in my body? What are those thoughts rattling around in my head? Do I need to believe them? That I made a mistake? Okay, I'm a human being. I made a mistake. So acceptance can unlock a whole lot of inner strength and resources that you may not have known were there. Again, this requires being gentle. For me, it does, but I keep repeating that because I know that that's so important. Some things come up really fast and you don't have time for all this. It's just, so when that happens, when you have a chance, step back, give yourself a little more time. If you can find a way to stay grounded, maybe with some meditation, you have a chance to make it through this maybe in a better way than you would have in the past. And even then, you can always remember that things are always changing. So even if this is terrible dukkha that you just can't seem to let go of this particular thing, it's spinning in your head. Well, it's going to change. I can't say when, but it will. That we can say, because that which arises will cease. I opened up my email right before this, and I get the Tricycle Daily email. If you guys are familiar with Tricycle Magazine, and if you're not, they do a daily email with a short thing, and it was talking right about this. And I'll just read the paragraph. The body is a powerful ally in spiritual practice. Think of your body as a gateway to the here and now. No matter how far your thoughts ever veer into the past or the future, the body is always anchored in the present moment. However tumultuous your emotions may be, you can always return to the center by bringing your awareness back to your physical being. It's great. I think that's great. So a simple example that I experienced last week, and it's almost trite, but I think it's not. I think it's worth, just might sound that way. So I was watching a lot about the presidential inauguration, and I was really deeply moved by it all. And it began the evening before with the ceremony at the Washington Mall honoring the over 400,000 people who have died from COVID in the United States. That was really touching, and I thought, wow, we haven't had anything like this whole time with all these people being gone. And the next day after the speeches, the poetry and the celebration, I went out for lunch with my wife. We sat outside and my head was really full. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it, but I wasn't feeling really clear. It was a little overwhelmed. And I was feeling confused, not about anything in particular, but I didn't feel centered and I was feeling kind of confused. I was also really tired because I didn't get enough sleep. And this had been a long 4 or 5 rough political years in this country for many of us. And I also knew that I had a really important phone call coming up at 4 o'clock. And I didn't want to sleepwalk through that phone call in a confused state. I wanted to be clear. I didn't think it would be fair to the other person. I didn't think it would be fair to me. And I know that feeling of overwhelm. I know that. And I've seen myself muddle through situations like it when I've had that, or ignoring that I wasn't at my best, or convincing myself and hoping that things would be okay. And I could say to myself, anyway, by 5 o'clock, that call is going to be over. What I didn't want to see, was that I was blaming myself for not being at top form that I wanted to be. And that old criticism that I wasn't really good enough started its way in, but I saw it and I knew it. And I said, oh, I know what this is. And it was really kind of easy to reject that. Without rejecting that I was feeling that way, I was able to not be a party of that way of thinking at that moment. And then all of a sudden, it was so easy and ridiculously simple. I saw that I was tired. I took a nap. Problem solved. Woke up, got on the phone call. I was alert. It was very productive, and I was just so simple. But if I had fought with myself internally, I don't think I would have taken a nap. I don't think I would have even thought to. I would have been off and running in other directions. So So as you realize that you're suffering in situations such as the one I just said, you can gain insight by investigating your feelings, both mental and physical, and that arise as a consequence. Um, okay, coming down to the wrapping this up here. So thanks for your patience. Um, I picked this phrase up from something I was reading. You can let go of this burden if you're willing to use the teaching skillfully. Tell yourself by setting an intention that I'm not going to get caught up in this anymore. I'm not going to participate in this game, nor will I give into this mood. Start putting yourself in the position of knowing, I know this is dukkha. There is dukkha. I just want to back up for a second because that one sentence about nor will I give into this mood, I'm not going to participate in this game, it's a little bit firmer than I would personally go because I can't always predict how I'm going to do with something like this. But the idea is there. And particularly start putting yourself in the position of knowing, I know that this is dukkha, there is dukkha. It's really important to make this resolution, to go where the suffering is and then abide with it. It's only by examining and confronting suffering in this way that one can hope to have the tremendous insight. This suffering has been understood. So whenever you feel suffering, you can first make the recognition there is suffering. Then it should be understood. And finally, it has been understood. The understanding of dukkha is the insight into the first noble truth. And I'll close with a phrase from a wonderful, inspiring poet laureate, Amanda Gorman. This is how she ended her poem in the inauguration, The Hill We Climb. Beautiful poem if you haven't heard it. But she ended with, there's always light if only we're brave enough to see it. That's what I've got for today, folks. I hope it's some of it's resonated with you. And thanks for listening.